My name is Matilda Hayes. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, most people would have described me with the same handful of words. Quiet, reliable, uncomplicated. I live in Seattle, where the rain is steady enough that you eventually stop noticing it. For the past 6 years, I've managed the evening shift at a small independent bookstore not far from Lake Union. It's the kind of place where regulars know which chair they like, and the bell on the door rings softly whenever someone steps inside. From the outside, my life probably looked ordinary. A stable marriage, a comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood, a routine that didn't raise eyebrows. My husband, Daniel, worked in commercial real estate. He was confident in a way people often admire. He spoke easily in rooms where I preferred to listen. If someone had asked us which of us handled the important things in life, most people would have assumed the answer was him. And to be fair, for a long time I let that assumption stand. I've never been someone who needed to correct every misunderstanding. Invisibility can be exhausting when you're younger. But after a while, you start to notice something interesting about it. People reveal more when they believe you're not really watching. For 15 years, Daniel and I shared everything the way couples are supposed to. A home, plans, and of course, a joint bank account that both our paychecks flowed into every month. At least, that's how it looked on paper. What Daniel believed, what he was absolutely certain of, was that if he ever decided to leave, he would walk away with the power, the money, the leverage, the advantage. And for a brief moment, he probably thought he did. Because the night before he filed for divorce, my husband emptied our joint account. Every dollar. He believed that by morning, I would wake up helpless, that I would panic, that I would scramble to figure out how to survive. But what he didn't realize was something surprisingly simple. Money doesn't just disappear. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every decision leaves a trail. And some people, the quiet ones especially, spend years learning exactly how to follow it. This story isn't about revenge. There's no shouting, no dramatic courtroom speeches, no moment where someone finally gets what they deserve. Instead, it's about patience, observation, and what happens when someone mistakes calm for weakness. Because the truth is, by the time Daniel emptied that account, the outcome had already begun, and the trail he left behind would change everything. But before any of that happened, before the bank statements and the lawyers and the silence that followed, there's something you should understand about the person everyone believed I was. So let me ask you something first. Have you ever noticed how easily people underestimate someone who doesn't feel the need to prove anything? For most of my adult life, I occupied a very specific space in the rooms I walked into. Not the center. Not even the edges where people argue or laugh too loudly. Somewhere quieter than that. If you had met me at one of Daniel's work events, you probably would have remembered him before you remembered me. He had a way of filling the air with confidence. Firm handshakes, easy stories, that relaxed tone people use when they believe they already belong wherever they are. And next to him, I was usually introduced in the same simple way. This is my wife, Matilda. Then a small pause. She manages a bookstore. People would smile politely when they heard that. The kind of smile that carries a quick mental summary. Peaceful job, low stress, not very complicated. Sometimes they'd say something like, "That must be nice," as if my life consisted mostly of sipping tea between stacks of novels. I never corrected them. Not because it was true, but explaining rarely changed anyone's assumptions. Daniel, on the other hand, leaned comfortably into those assumptions. In his world, things were structured around visible results. Deals closed, buildings sold, numbers that impressed people during dinner conversations. Compared to that, my quiet routines didn't seem particularly remarkable. And over time, a subtle narrative formed around us. Daniel was the decisive one, the provider, the person who handled serious matters. I was the calm support system orbiting around that. Even in our own home, this story quietly repeated itself. When friends visited, Daniel poured the drinks and told stories about negotiations or market trends. People asked him questions about investments or property values. I refilled plates in the kitchen and listened to the rhythm of conversations drifting through the hallway. No one meant anything cruel by it. That's the thing about being underestimated. Most of the time, it isn't loud. It's gentle, almost comfortable. At some point, people simply decide who you are and stop looking any deeper. Daniel wasn't a villain. Not then, at least. He wasn't harsh or openly dismissive. In fact, if anyone had asked him about me, he would have described me with genuine affection. "Matilda keeps everything steady," he used to say. "She's the calm one." What he meant was, that I didn't challenge him publicly. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't compete for attention. And for many years, that arrangement worked. Partly because I never needed attention in the way some people do. Observation has always been more interesting to me than performance. Running the bookstore sharpened that habit even further. When you spend your days surrounded by readers, you learn something valuable about human behavior. People reveal themselves solely in the books they choose, in the way they hold conversations, in the details they assume no one notices. Patterns become visible if you watch long enough, and watching had become second nature to me. What Daniel didn't understand, what almost no one understood, was that quiet people often carry entire inner worlds that remain invisible to others. I wasn't passive. I was attentive. When Daniel talked about market fluctuations over dinner, I listened. When he mentioned new partnerships or property investments, I listened. When our monthly bank notifications appeared on my phone, I noticed those too. Not with suspicion, just attention. It never felt unusual to keep track of things. I'd always been careful with money, long before Daniel and I met. My parents had taught me that financial stability wasn't about earning the most. It was about understanding where everything flowed. Still, none of that seemed important to anyone else. To Daniel's colleagues, I was the quiet wife. To neighbors, I was the polite woman who recommended good books. To Daniel himself, I was dependable, predictable, safe. And in a strange way, that perception protected something I didn't fully recognize at the time. Because when people believe they understand you completely, they stop questioning what you're capable of. They assume the story has already been written. Looking back now, I realized something important about those early years. The person they thought I was only the surface. And the first small crack in that surface appeared in a moment so subtle that almost no one else would have remembered it. But I did, because small things often reveal the truth long before the big moments arrive. The first moment I remember clearly wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no argument that made the room go quiet. Just a small sentence spoken casually over dinner. Daniel and I were sitting at our kitchen table on a Thursday evening. The kind of night where everything felt ordinary. Rain tapping against the windows, a half-finished bottle of wine between us. My phone was resting beside my plate as a bank notification briefly lit up the screen. I glanced at it out of habit. Daniel noticed. "What was that?" I asked. "Just the account notification," I said. "Your bonus came through." He nodded, barely interested. "Good." Then he leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking we should simplify things." "Simplify?" I asked. "Yeah, financial stuff." He gestured vaguely toward my phone. "You don't need to worry about all the numbers. That's more my area anyway." The words weren't sharp. They were delivered with the same easy confidence he used when discussing real estate contracts or market predictions. But something about the phrasing lingered. "You don't need to worry about all the numbers." At first, I assumed he meant it kindly. Daniel had always liked feeling responsible for the larger financial picture. It gave him a sense of control, and I had never tried to take that away from him. Still, I tilted my head slightly. "I don't mind keeping track of them," I said lightly. "I've always done that." He smiled, the way people do when they believe they're gently correcting something unimportant. "Sure," he said, "but you handle the everyday stuff. Groceries, bills, that kind of thing. Investments and bigger moves are more complicated." Then he added something that seemed harmless in the moment. "I just don't want you stressing about it." I remember staring at the condensation sliding slowly down my glass. Because the strange part wasn't what he said. It was what he assumed. Daniel had never actually asked what I understood about finances. He had simply decided. And the conversation moved on almost immediately. He started talking about a property deal one of his partners was negotiating in Bellevue. I listened the way I usually did, quietly, patiently, while he described projected returns and risk percentages. From the outside, nothing about that evening would have seemed unusual. But something small had shifted in the way I was hearing him. Not anger, not even hurt, just awareness. A tiny recalibration. Later that night, while Daniel was in the shower, I opened the banking app again. Not because I distrusted him, because I was curious. The bonus deposit was exactly what he'd said it would be. The account balances were stable. Our savings, investments, and monthly expenses all looked exactly the way they had the previous month. Everything was normal. Still, I opened the transaction history and scrolled slowly. Habit. I had always liked seeing patterns. understanding where things moved and why. Numbers, when arranged over time, tell quiet stories. Most people never read them carefully. After a few minutes, I locked my phone and set it on the nightstand. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of water running in the bathroom. Daniel came to bed a little later, relaxed and unaware that the earlier conversation had stayed with me. To him, it had probably been nothing more than a passing thought. But sometimes the smallest remarks reveal the shape of someone's assumptions. And once you notice those assumptions, you start seeing them everywhere. Not because you're looking for conflict, but because you're finally paying attention. At the time, I didn't know that this tiny moment, this quiet dinner conversation, was the first thread of a much larger pattern. A pattern that would repeat itself again and again, until eventually it became impossible not to see. At first, the small moments didn't feel like disrespect. They felt like adjustments, tiny shifts in tone. Small decisions are made on my behalf instead of with me. Nothing dramatic enough to challenge, nothing obvious enough for anyone else to notice. But once you see the pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee it. A few weeks after that dinner conversation, Daniel and I attended one of his company's networking events. It was held at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the water. Soft lighting, polished wood tables, the quiet hum of business conversations drifting through the air. I stood beside Daniel while he spoke with two colleagues about a new development project. One of them turned to me politely. "So, Matilda, what do you do again?" "I manage a bookstore." "Sure," I said. He nodded with mild interest. That must be relaxing compared to what Daniel deals with. Before I could respond, Daniel chuckled lightly. "Oh, Matilda stays far away from the complicated stuff," he said. "She's the calm side of the household." Everyone laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter, just a casual agreement. The conversation moved on immediately, shifting back to investment strategies and construction timelines. I didn't interrupt, but something about the moment stayed with me the entire evening. Not because Daniel had insulted me, because he had defined me, quietly, publicly, without hesitation. And the strange thing was, no one questioned it. Why would they? People believe the version of you that's presented most confidently. Over the next few months, moments like that happened often enough that they began to blend together. When friends asked about financial planning, Daniel answered. When someone mentioned market trends, Daniel explained them. When conversations drifted toward budgeting or investments, he often added small comments like, "Matilda doesn't worry about that stuff." Or sometimes the sasa busasai. "She trusts me to handle the numbers." Each time it was said with a smile. Each time I stayed quiet. Part of me understood why. Conflict over small things rarely leads anywhere useful. Correcting someone publicly, especially your own spouse, creates tension that lingers long after the moment ends. And for a long time, maintaining peace seemed more important than clarifying perceptions. So I told myself a simple story. It's not worth arguing about. Daniel isn't trying to hurt you. It's just easier this way. That's how normalization happens. Not through one dramatic event, but through repetition. Small assumptions repeated often enough that they become an accepted reality. Even inside your own mind. I continued managing the bookstore. I continued listening during dinners and social gatherings. I continued noticing details most people overlooked. And occasionally, when Daniel talked about complex financial arrangements, I would ask a quiet question. Not confrontational, just curious. Why structure the deal that way? Wouldn't that increase the tax exposure? Does the partnership agreement cover that scenario? The first few times, Daniel answered casually, but after a while his responses changed. You don't need to worry about that. Or sometimes, it's a little more complicated than it sounds. The interesting part wasn't the dismissal, it was the certainty behind it. Daniel had become completely comfortable with the version of me he believed in. A version that was supportive, dependable, and comfortably uninvolved. And the longer that belief continued, the more natural it became for everyone around us. Looking back now, I realized something subtle about that period. I wasn't invisible, I was simply unexamined. People saw exactly what they expected to see. And because I didn't challenge those expectations loudly, they assumed the picture was accurate. But quiet observation has its own kind of power. While others were becoming comfortable with their assumptions, I was beginning to understand the role they had assigned me. And once you recognize the role people expect you to play, you're faced with a quiet decision. Do you fight it immediately? Or do you learn how the script works first? Once you recognize the role people expect you to play, you start noticing how consistently they place you back into it. Not forcefully, Just naturally, like a chair that always gets pushed back into the same corner of the room. For me, that role was simple. I was the steady one, the agreeable one, the person who kept things running quietly while other people made the visible decisions. At first, it didn't feel unfair. Every relationship develops its own balance. Daniel handled certain things, I handled others. That's how we had always operated. But over time, the boundaries of that balance began to shift. And interestingly, the shift rarely came with a conversation. It came with assumptions. One evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual, his phone pressed against his shoulder while he loosened his tie. Yeah, we'll finalize the numbers tomorrow, he said into the call as he walked past me in the kitchen. I was slicing vegetables for dinner. He ended the call and dropped his keys into the bowl by the door. Everything okay? Everything okay? I asked. Yeah, he said. Just some restructuring with one of the partnerships. I nodded, waiting for him to elaborate the way he sometimes did. Instead, he opened the fridge and grabbed a bottle of water. Don't worry about it, he added casually. It's complicated. The phrase landed softly in the air. Complicated. It had become one of his favorite words whenever money entered the conversation. I didn't respond right away. Not because I felt excluded, but I realized something subtle about the way Daniel viewed our life. In his mind, complexity belonged to him. Simplicity belonged to me. It wasn't something he had consciously decided. It was simply the story that had formed over years of small interactions. And once a story settles in someone's mind, they rarely question it. Over the next few months, the pattern became clearer. When the new financial statements arrived, Daniel glanced at them first. When tax documents came in the mail, he set them aside for later. When I occasionally asked questions, he answered briefly before shifting the subject. None of it felt aggressive, but the message underneath remained consistent. Trust me, I've got it handled. Most people would probably find comfort in that, but I've never been particularly comfortable relying on someone else's understanding of things that affect both of us. Not because I distrust people, because I prefer clarity. And clarity often hides in the details no one bothers to examine. One quiet Saturday morning, I sat at the dining table with a cup of coffee while Daniel slept in. The house was still. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, leaving thin lines of light across the table. Beside my notebook sat a small stack of unopened financial envelopes that had arrived during the week. I looked at them for a long moment. Then I opened the first one. Inside was a routine statement, nothing unusual. The second envelope contained an investment summary, also normal. The third one was slightly different, a notice about an adjustment to one of Daniel's business accounts. Not alarming, just informative. Still, I read the document carefully before placing it back in the envelope. Then I opened my notebook and wrote the date beside a short description, not out of suspicion, out of habit. I had always written things down, small details, dates, patterns. It helped me see connections more clearly over time. Daniel never noticed the notebook. Most people didn't. To them, it was probably just another small object on the table. But that morning, as I closed it and took another sip of coffee, I realized something quietly important. The role people assign you only defines you if you accept it completely. And while everyone around me seemed comfortable believing I was simply the calm, uncomplicated part of our household, I had never actually agreed to stop paying attention. For a long time, nothing truly changed. The patterns continued. Daniel handled the conversations that sounded important. I maintained the quiet routines that kept our daily life running smoothly. And if you had asked me then whether something was wrong, I probably would have said no. Not because everything was perfect, because everything was predictable. Predictability can feel a lot like stability, but sometimes the shift that changes everything doesn't arrive through conflict. It arrives through clarity. The moment that changed something for me happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at the bookstore. It was slow that day. Rain had kept most customers away, and the soft jazz playlist drifting through the speakers made the whole space feel even quieter than usual. I was behind the counter, reviewing the week's inventory numbers, when an older man named Harold came in. Harold had been a regular for years. He was the kind of customer who browsed slowly and always left with 2 or 3 books tucked under his arm. But that afternoon, he wasn't looking at the shelves. He walked straight to the counter and rested his hands on the polished wood. "You're good with numbers, aren't you?" he asked. The question surprised me. "I try to be," I said with a small smile. He nodded thoughtfully. "My daughter is going through a divorce," he said. "Messy one." I didn't respond right away. People sometimes share unexpected things in bookstores. Something about being surrounded by quiet spaces and stories makes strangers more comfortable speaking honestly. Harold continued. Her husband thought he was clever, he said. Moved money around, closed accounts, tried to make it look like there wasn't much left. He paused before adding something that stayed with me. Turns out financial trails are harder to erase than people think. I tilted my head slightly. What happened? Harold chuckled softly. A forensic accountant happened. The way he said it wasn't dramatic, just factual. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every hidden account, they traced it all. He shrugged. People who think money disappears don't understand how records work. Then he picked up a book from the counter and smiled. My daughter's doing fine now. The conversation ended there. Harold paid for his book, thanked me as he always did, and walked back out into the rain. But the quiet that followed felt different. I stood behind the counter for several minutes without moving. Not because the story was shocking, because something about it aligned perfectly with thoughts that had been quietly forming in my mind for months. Financial trails are harder to erase than people think. The phrase settled somewhere deep in my thoughts. Later that evening, after closing the bookstore, I sat in my car for a few extra minutes before driving home. Seattle's streets were slick with rain, reflecting the glow of streetlights in long golden lines. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to examine something honestly. Not Daniel's behavior, my own silence. I had spent years watching patterns, noticing details, and writing things down without ever asking myself a simple question. What exactly was I preparing for? At the time, nothing dramatic was happening. Daniel hadn't betrayed me. Our life hadn't collapsed. But something inside me had shifted quietly that afternoon. Not suspicion, not fear, just awareness. Because Harold's story reminded me of something I already understood but hadn't fully acknowledged. Information has weight, details accumulate, and the person who pays attention often sees the full picture long before anyone else realizes it exists. That night, after Daniel went to sleep, I opened my notebook again. And for the first time, I didn't just record what had happened. I started organizing it, not because I expected anything to go wrong, but because clarity, once it begins forming, has a way of asking to be completed. After that afternoon in the bookstore, nothing about my life appeared different. Daniel still left for work early most mornings. I still walked to the bookstore in the afternoons. Dinner conversations still drifted between routine topics, work schedules, neighbors, weekend plans. From the outside, everything continued exactly as it had before, but something subtle inside me had changed. Before, my quietness had mostly been instinct. Now it has become intentional. Silence, when chosen carefully, can be more revealing than questions. I stopped asking Daniel about his work entirely, not out of resentment, simply because I didn't need to. People often explain more when they believe no one is examining what they say. And Daniel was no exception. Without my occasional questions, he began talking more freely about his projects at the dinner table. Not in detail, he still kept most of the technical aspects to himself, but enough to create a loose outline of his professional life. A property sale here, a partnership adjustment there, occasional frustrations with investors or contractors. I listened the way I always had, patiently. But now I was also placing those details alongside other information. Dates from bank notifications, statements arriving in the mail, numbers that shifted slightly month to month. Not with suspicion, with curiosity. The notebook on our dining table gradually filled with small observations. Nothing dramatic, just patterns. Transfers that happened regularly at the same time each month. Business accounts connected to certain projects, Daniel mentioned casually over dinner. Investment movements that lined up neatly with conversations he assumed I had already forgotten. What fascinated me most wasn't the money itself. It was the predictability. Daniel's professional world operated on cycles. Deals opened, closed, and reorganized with a rhythm that became clearer the longer I watched. And because he believed I wasn't particularly interested in finances, he never felt the need to conceal those rhythms from me. That assumption made everything easier. Weeks passed quietly, then months. Occasionally, Daniel would make small comments that reminded me how firmly his perception of me had settled. One evening, while reviewing something on his laptop, he glanced up and said casually, "You're lucky you don't have to deal with all this." "Or what?" I asked. "The financial side of things," he said. It's exhausting sometimes." I gave a small smile. "I'm sure." He nodded, satisfied, and returned to his screen. Moments like that would have bothered me in the past. Now they simply confirmed something useful. Daniel wasn't pretending to misunderstand me. He truly believed I preferred not to know. And the longer that belief remained intact, the more transparent his world became to me. Quiet observation has a strange effect on time. Days move normally, but understanding accumulates slowly beneath the surface. By the time autumn arrived, my notebook contained nearly a year of small financial notes. Not detailed spreadsheets, just connections, dates aligned with conversations, amounts that appeared repeatedly, accounts that interacted more often than others. No conclusions, just structure. And that structure revealed something I hadn't expected. Daniel was very confident about the systems he used, confident enough that he rarely imagined anyone else mapping them quietly from the outside. Most people associate silence with passivity, but silence can also be patience, a willingness to let the full picture appear before reacting to any single piece of it. By then, I understood something clearly. Whatever role Daniel believed I played in our life, it gave me an unusual advantage, because while he moved comfortably through a world he assumed only he understood, I had begun to see how every part of it connected. By the time a full year had passed, my routine had developed two quiet layers. The visible one never changed. I opened the bookstore at noon. I recommended novels to customers who wandered in from the rain. I hosted small reading groups on Thursday evenings where people discussed stories over cups of tea. To most people, my life appeared slow and uncomplicated. But beneath that surface, another routine had begun forming, one that almost no one noticed. Every Sunday morning, I sat at the dining table with my coffee and my notebook. Daniel usually slept late on weekends, especially after busy weeks at work. The house was always quiet during those hours, perfect for thinking. At first, my notes had simply been observations, dates, amounts, account names, small fragments of information that meant very little on their own. But after months of collecting them, patterns started becoming clearer. Not because I was searching for wrongdoing, because financial systems, like most systems, eventually reveal their structure if you observe them long enough. I began organizing my notebook differently. Instead of writing entries chronologically, I created small sections. Recurring transactions, investment shifts, business transfers, Daniel mentioned casually during dinner. Once those categories existed, something interesting happened. Connections appeared almost immediately. A transfer that seemed random in March appeared again in July. Another one resurfaced in November, always within a similar range, always linked to the same account number. None of it was unusual in isolation, but repetition has a way of creating meaning. To understand those patterns more clearly, I started doing something else. Learning. Not in a dramatic, life-altering way, just quiet reading in the evenings. The bookstore gave me access to more financial literature than most people realize. Business memoirs, investment guides, books on corporate structures and tax planning. Customers often ordered them, and unsold copies eventually ended up on our discount shelves. I took a few home, then a few more. At night, after Daniel fell asleep, I read about partnership structures, about asset movement, about something called forensic accounting, the careful tracing of financial activity over time. The subject fascinated me more than I expected, not because I was planning to investigate anyone, because the logic behind it was beautifully simple. Money rarely disappears. It moves. And every movement leaves a record somewhere. Digital banking systems track transactions automatically. Tax documentation creates parallel trails. Corporate filings reveal ownership changes. What looks invisible at first glance often becomes perfectly visible once you know where to look. The more I read, the more my notebook entries began to make sense. Not as isolated details, but as parts of a larger map. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I began reconstructing the general shape of Daniel's financial ecosystem. His primary business account. Secondary accounts are connected to different investment groups, transfers between them that aligned with the deals he mentioned casually during dinners. Again, none of it suggested anything illegal or dishonest, but the structure itself was becoming clear. One evening, while Daniel was out attending a networking event, I sat at the dining table reviewing several months of notes. Outside, Seattle's streets were wet with winter rain, reflecting the soft glow of streetlights through the window. I turned a page in the notebook and noticed something new. One account number appeared more frequently than the others, not part of our joint finances. A separate account Daniel had opened several years earlier for business purposes. At least, that's how he had described it at the time. Most of the transfers involving that account were small, routine, but every few months, something slightly larger moved through it before disappearing again. Not suspicious, just interesting. I wrote the account number down on a new page and circled it lightly. Then I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. For a long time, I had simply been observing, learning. Understanding the landscape, Daniel moved through so confidently. But that night, for the first time, I realized something quietly important. Observation had turned into preparation. Not intentionally, just naturally. Because when you spend enough time studying a system, you eventually begin to see the points where it could shift, where pressure might travel, where decisions could ripple outward. Daniel believed he was the only person in our household who understood the financial machinery of our life. But what he never noticed was that someone sitting quietly across the dinner table had spent an entire year learning how every part of that machinery worked. And once you understand a system completely, you start recognizing the moments when it might break. The moment of clarity didn't arrive with excitement. There was no sudden feeling of victory, no rush of adrenaline, just stillness. It happened on a quiet Wednesday evening while Daniel was traveling for a conference in San Diego. The house felt unusually silent without him. I had made a simple dinner for myself, washed the dishes, and sat down at the dining table with my notebook the way I often did. Rain tapped softly against the windows, steady and familiar. I opened the notebook to the page where I had circled that account number weeks earlier. At first, I simply reviewed the entries again. Dates, amounts, transfers between accounts. Then I opened my laptop and logged into our joint banking portal. The screen glowed softly in the dim room. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I was just curious whether the most recent statements had arrived. They had. I downloaded the latest transaction summary and scrolled slowly through the list. For a few minutes, everything looked routine. Groceries, utility bills, a restaurant charge from a dinner Daniel had mentioned earlier that week. Then something else appeared. A transfer, not from the account I had circled, but to it. The amount wasn't enormous, but it was larger than most of the movements I had recorded previously. I leaned slightly closer to the screen. The transfer originated from our joint account, and the description field contained a short note. Internal allocation. That phrase was vague enough to mean almost anything, but the date caught my attention. It was scheduled for the following Friday, 2 days away. I sat there quietly for a moment, letting the information settle. Daniel had never mentioned moving funds out of our joint account. Normally, larger financial decisions were something he at least referenced in conversation, but this one had passed through without a word. Again, that alone wasn't alarming. Couples sometimes handle finances differently. Daniel managed the broader structure of our investments. A transfer could easily be related to one of his business arrangements. Still, something about the timing felt deliberate. I opened the previous statements and checked the history. Over the past year, similar transfers had occurred 4 times. Each one moved money from the joint account to that same secondary account. But what happened afterward was more interesting. Within a few days, the money moved again. Not back to us, somewhere else. Another account number, one I had never seen before. I stared at the screen for a long time, tracing the sequence of transactions with my finger. Joint account, secondary account, then a third destination. It wasn't hidden exactly. The records were all there. But the structure created distance, layers, the kind that makes financial movement appear more complicated than it actually is. I closed the laptop slowly, not because I felt shocked, because something inside my mind had finally aligned. For months, I had been mapping the edges of Daniel's financial world without understanding why a few pieces didn't quite fit. Now those pieces are connected. Daniel had been quietly moving money out of our shared account at regular intervals. Not massive amounts, just enough to accumulate over time. And the pattern suggested something important. Preparation, not for a business deal, for separation. The realization didn't hurt the way you might expect. In fact, the dominant feeling was clarity, almost relief. Because uncertainty is far heavier than truth, I opened my notebook again and wrote down the date of the upcoming transfer. Then I added something else beside it. A simple question. Where does it go next? If the pattern continued, the funds would move again shortly after reaching the secondary account. And if I followed that movement carefully, I might finally understand the destination Daniel had been quietly building toward. The rain outside had grown heavier by then, tapping steadily against the glass. I sat at the table for a while longer, thinking about what the pattern meant. Not about betrayal, not about anger, just about possibilities. Because once you see leverage clearly, the next decision becomes unavoidable. Do you ignore it, or do you follow it all the way to the end? The night I understood the pattern clearly, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't send messages or ask questions about the transfer scheduled for Friday. Instead, I closed my notebook and went to bed. Sleep came more easily than I expected. Clarity has a strange effect on the mind. When uncertainty disappears, even uncomfortable truths begin to feel stable. The next morning, I woke up at the same time I always did. Coffee, a quiet walk to the bookstore, A slow afternoon of helping customers find books they hadn't realized they needed. From the outside, nothing about my day suggested that anything inside my marriage had changed. But the entire time, one question moved quietly through my thoughts. What do you do when you finally understand the direction someone else has been moving toward? Daniel returned from San Diego that evening, tired but cheerful in the easy way he often was after successful business trips. He placed his suitcase by the door and kissed my cheek. "Miss me?" he asked lightly. "Of course," I said. And in that moment, I realized something important. Daniel didn't believe I suspected anything. He moved through the house with the relaxed confidence of someone who assumes the structure around him is completely stable. That confidence was built on the version of me he had accepted years earlier, the quiet wife, the one who trusted him to handle complicated matters. And because he believed that version completely, he didn't notice anything unusual in my behavior. Dinner was simple that night. We talked about his conference, a restaurant he had visited with colleagues, and a speaker who had given a presentation on emerging property markets. I listened the same way I always had, but now every detail carried a different kind of weight. Not because I was searching for lies, because I was measuring how far ahead he believed he already was. Friday arrived 2 days later. The scheduled transfer appeared exactly when I expected it. I saw the notification on my phone while restocking a shelf in the bookstore. The amount moved from our joint account to the secondary account that Daniel controlled. Just like the previous 4 times. Predictable, deliberate. I placed the phone back in my pocket and continued working. By then, the situation had become remarkably clear. Daniel wasn't improvising. He was preparing. Quietly relocating money in advance of something he hadn't yet revealed. And that realization brought me to a quiet crossroads. There were several ways I could respond. The simplest option would have been confrontation. Ask him directly, "Why are you moving money? Where is it going?" But confrontation rarely reveals the full picture. People explain only what they feel forced to explain. Another option was avoidance. Ignore the pattern. Pretend I had never noticed it. Continue our life exactly as it had been. But ignoring knowledge rarely makes it disappear. And then there was the third option. Observation. Patience. Follow the trail all the way to its final destination before making any decisions at all. I stood behind the bookstore counter that afternoon, thinking about the 3 choices in front of me. Each one led to a different future. Only one of them guaranteed complete understanding. So I made a decision. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet internal commitment. I would continue watching, continue learning, continue documenting every step of the pattern that Daniel believed no one else could see. Because if he was building something in secret, then the smartest response wasn't an interruption. It was preparation. And preparation requires patience. What Daniel didn't realize yet was something very simple. The moment he began moving money quietly, he created a trail. And once a trail exists, someone patient enough can follow it much further than the person who left it behind ever intended. After that Friday transfer, my routine changed again. Not on the surface. Daniel still saw the same version of me he always had. The quiet wife who worked afternoons at the bookstore and listened politely when he described the highlights of his day. But behind that calm surface, something new had begun. Preparation had turned into movement. Quiet movement. The first thing I did was something very simple. I opened a bank account that belonged only to me. Not because I expected immediate conflict. Many people maintain individual accounts for personal expenses or savings. There was nothing unusual about it. Still, I didn't mention it to Daniel. Not out of secrecy, just to independence. A small financial space that existed outside the structure he believed he controlled. Once the account existed, I began redirecting small portions of my bookstore income into it. Nothing dramatic, just quiet deposits. Over time, those deposits formed a modest cushion, enough to ensure that if anything unexpected happened, I wouldn't be standing completely unprepared. While that was happening, I continued observing Daniel's transfers. Just as I had predicted, the money he moved into the secondary account didn't stay there long. Within a few days, it shifted again, always to the same third account. An account that had no connection to our shared finances, at least not directly. I documented every movement carefully in my notebook. Dates, amounts, timing between transfers. Patterns that had once looked abstract were now becoming unmistakably clear. Daniel wasn't simply moving money. He was consolidating it somewhere else, slowly. Methodically. The structure reminded me of something I had read during my late-night research months earlier. Layering. A technique often used in complex financial systems where funds move through several intermediate accounts before reaching their final destination. Not illegal in itself, but extremely effective at creating distance between the original source and the final location. Daniel probably believed that distance made the process invisible, but financial systems are rarely as opaque as people imagine, especially when someone inside the original structure is paying close attention. One evening, while Daniel was in the living room answering emails, I sat at the dining table reviewing the latest statements. The third account appeared again. Another transfer had landed there earlier that afternoon, and something about the cumulative total made me pause. I added the numbers together slowly. Every transfer from the past year! All the movements that had passed quietly through the secondary account before disappearing into that third destination. The total was significant. Not everything we had, but enough to matter. Enough to suggest that Daniel wasn't preparing for a temporary financial shift. He was preparing for separation. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The house was quiet except for the faint tapping of Daniel's keyboard in the next room. He had no idea I was sitting 10 feet away, reconstructing the financial structure he believed was completely hidden. And strangely, the realization didn't fill me with anger. It filled me with calm. Because once the full pattern becomes visible, the emotional chaos people expect rarely arrives. Instead, you gain something more useful: time. Daniel believed he was several steps ahead of me, but what he didn't realize was that I had already begun moving in my own direction. Not loudly, not confrontationally, just carefully placing the pieces of my life in positions where they could stand independently, if they ever needed to. Because the quietest preparation often creates the strongest foundation. And by the time Daniel finished building whatever plan he believed would surprise me, I intended to be ready for it. Winter arrived quietly that year. Seattle's grey skies settled lower over the city, and the bookstore filled with customers escaping the cold drizzle outside. Inside, the warm lights and the smell of paper created the same calm atmosphere it always had. My life on the surface still looked completely ordinary. But beneath that routine, Daniel's quiet financial movements had continued exactly as before. Transfer. Pause. Another transfer. The pattern repeated so consistently that I no longer needed to search for it. My phone notifications told the story automatically, and each time they appeared, I wrote down the details. Not out of obsession, just completion. By January, the structure Daniel had been building for more than a year had reached a point where its purpose was impossible to ignore. The third account, the one receiving the layered transfers, now held a balance large enough to support a completely separate life. A new apartment, legal fees, months, maybe even years of financial independence. Daniel had almost finished preparing. The interesting part was that nothing about his behavior at home had changed. He still asked about my day at the bookstore, still talked casually about work projects over dinner, still moved through our house with the calm confidence of someone who believed everything around him was stable. But the consequences of his quiet decisions had already begun forming, just not in the way he expected. Because while Daniel had been preparing for departure, I had been preparing for awareness. One afternoon, during a slow shift at the bookstore, I stepped outside for a short break and called someone I hadn't spoken to in several years. Her name was Claire Donovan. Claire and I had gone to university together long before Daniel, and I was married. After graduation, our lives had taken very different paths. While I moved toward quiet work in bookstores and small businesses, Claire pursued something far more technical. She became a financial investigator. Forensic accounting specifically. We hadn't stayed in close contact, but the number was still saved in my phone. She answered on the third ring. "Matilda," she said, sounding surprised but pleased. "Hi, Claire." We spoke casually at first. The kind of warm, catching-up conversation people have when reconnecting after a long time. Jobs, cities, life changes. Then after a few minutes, I asked her something simple. If someone wanted to understand where money moved after it left one account, I said carefully, how difficult would that be? Claire laughed softly. That depends, she said, on how patient the person asking the question is. I'm patient. Well, she replied, financial systems are basically giant maps. If the transactions exist, the trail exists. You just have to know how to read it. Her tone wasn't suspicious. Just professional curiosity. I didn't explain Daniel's situation. Not yet. Instead, I asked a few more general questions about layered transfers, about account tracing, about the ways financial movement can appear complex, even when it isn't. Claire answered everything calmly. Before we ended the call, she said something that stayed with me. Most people who try to move money quietly forget one thing. What's that? I asked. Every step they take creates documentation that's somewhere. She paused, and documentation has a very long memory. That evening, when I returned home, Daniel was sitting on the couch reviewing something on his laptop. He looked up and smiled. "How was work?" "Quiet," I said, which was true. What he didn't realize was that the quiet phase of this story was almost over. Not because I was planning a confrontation, because once preparation reaches its natural conclusion, the consequences begin unfolding on their own. And Daniel had just finished building the structure that would eventually reveal everything he believed was hidden. The morning Daniel told me he wanted a divorce was surprisingly quiet. No argument had led up to it. No tension had exploded the night before. When I woke up that Tuesday, the house felt exactly the same as it always had. Daniel was already dressed when I came into the kitchen. His coffee sat untouched on the counter, and a small stack of papers rested beside it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "Matilda," he said, his voice careful but steady, "we need to talk." People often describe moments like that as shocking, but I remember feeling something else entirely. Recognition. Daniel gestured toward the table. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, "and I don't think our marriage is working anymore." His words sounded rehearsed. Not cruel, but structured the way people organize difficult conversations in advance. He continued explaining. We had grown apart. Our lives were moving in different directions. He believed it would be better for both of us to separate before resentment made things worse. While he spoke, I noticed something interesting. He avoided looking directly at me for long periods of time. His attention drifted toward the papers on the table. Eventually, he pushed them slightly forward. "They're preliminary documents," he said. "Nothing final yet. Divorce filings. Prepared but not submitted." Then he added something that revealed more than he probably intended. "I also moved the money out of the joint account last night," he said carefully. "Just temporarily while we sort everything out." I didn't reach for the papers. Instead, I asked a simple question. "All of it?" Daniel nodded. "It's cleaner that way," he said. "Lawyers usually recommend separating finances early in the process." There was a pause. He seemed to be waiting for a reaction. Shock, anger, panic, something emotional that would confirm the role he had always believed I played. But none of those reactions arrived, because the transfer notification had appeared on my phone hours earlier while I was still asleep. And more importantly, I already knew exactly where the money had gone. The same secondary account. The same third destination it had moved to every other time. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. "I know this is sudden," he continued, his voice tightening a little, "but we'll figure everything out fairly." Fairly. The word hung in the air between us. From Daniel's perspective, fairness probably meant negotiation, dividing assets, rebuilding financial structures from the version of reality he had quietly been preparing for. But what he didn't realize in that moment was something very simple. The system he believed he controlled had already recorded everything he'd done. Every transfer, every layered movement, every quiet step he had taken to relocate money away from our shared life. And once documentation exists, it doesn't disappear. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Matilda," he said gently, "I know this is a lot to process." For the first time, I looked directly at the papers on the table. Then I looked back at him. "You're right," I said calmly. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Perhaps he thought agreement meant surrender. But the truth was much simpler. The situation had reached a point where nothing could be undone anymore. Daniel had already moved the money, already built the financial structure he believed would protect him, already initiated the process he thought would leave me unprepared. And in doing so, he had finished creating the evidence trail that explained everything. What Daniel didn't understand yet was that preparation works both ways. And while he believed the decisive moment had just arrived, in reality it had passed much earlier. Daniel expected an argument. I could see it in the way he sat across from me at the kitchen table that morning. His posture was careful, almost defensive. The way someone prepares for emotional turbulence before it begins. But the turbulence never arrived. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house felt unusually quiet. Even the rain outside seemed softer than usual. Daniel cleared his throat again. "I didn't want to do this suddenly," he said. "But dragging things out wouldn't help either." I nodded slightly. "That makes sense." The calmness in my voice seemed to confuse him. His eyes searched my face as if he were trying to locate the reaction he expected. "I know the financial part might feel overwhelming right now," he added, "but the lawyers will sort through everything." Overwhelming. That word might have landed differently a year earlier, but now it simply sounded outdated. I took a slow sip of coffee before speaking. You moved the money last night, I said. Yes, to the same account you've been using for the past year. Daniel blinked. It was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time since the conversation began, his confidence shifted slightly. I'm not sure what you mean, he said carefully. I reached for my notebook on the table, the same worn leather notebook that had sat quietly in our home for years. Most people never notice objects that remain in the same place for a long time. I opened it to one of the middle pages. Dates filled the margins. Short notes beside them. Transfer amounts. Account identifiers. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the page. Then to the next one. And the next. The silence between us changed. What is this? He asked. Your transfer history, I said calmly. He leaned back in his chair. That's not. It's accurate, I said gently. I turned another page. This is when the first movement happened, last February. Then another. And this is the fourth transfer, November. Daniel's expression had lost its earlier certainty. You've been tracking my accounts? He asked. Not your accounts, I corrected. Our money. Another long silence followed. Daniel looked down at the notebook again. What exactly are you trying to say? He asked. I closed the notebook slowly. Nothing confrontational, I said. Just that every transfer leaves documentation. He didn't respond. So I continued. You moved funds from the joint account into a secondary account you control. Then they moved again to a third account. His jaw tightened slightly. That's normal business structuring. It can be, I agreed. Another pause. Then I added one more sentence. But documentation doesn't disappear just because money moves. Daniel looked at me carefully now. Not as the quiet wife who stayed out of complicated matters, but as someone he was suddenly seeing things differently. What are you planning to do? He asked. The question carried less confidence than his earlier statements. I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered honestly. I'm not planning anything dramatic. No anger, no raised voices, just calm certainty. Your lawyer will explain the rest once the documentation is reviewed. Daniel sat back slowly in his chair. For the first time that morning, the conversation had moved outside the structure he had prepared. Not through confrontation, through clarity. And clarity, once it enters a room, has a way of changing every assumption that existed before it. In the months that followed, life did something interesting. It became quieter, not emptier, just quieter. The legal process moved forward the way most legal processes do. Slowly, methodically, guided by documents and timelines rather than emotions. Daniel hired a lawyer. So did I. Most of our communication shifted from conversations at the kitchen table to structured discussions between professionals who spoke the careful language of asset division and financial documentation. The notebook I had filled over the past year eventually became something more formal. Not evidence in a dramatic courtroom sense, just context. A timeline that explained the sequence of financial movements long before the divorce papers appeared. Once the transactions were examined within that timeline, the structure Daniel had created became very easy to understand. Funds moved from a joint account into accounts controlled solely by him. Repeatedly, months before any discussion of separation. That detail mattered. Not emotionally, legally. In the end, the resolution wasn't explosive. There were no dramatic moments where someone won, just adjustments, corrections. Money that had quietly moved out of shared space was recognized as marital assets again. Documentation has a way of doing that. Daniel and I didn't argue during those months. In fact, we rarely spoke at all. Our last conversation happened when he came to collect the final few things from the house. A bookshelf, some personal papers, a framed photograph from a trip we took years earlier. The interaction lasted less than 10 minutes. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us tried to revisit the past. Some endings don't need explanation. When the door closed behind him, the house felt unfamiliar for a few minutes. Then something else settled in. Stillness. Not loneliness. Just space. For the first time in many years, every decision inside that house belonged entirely to me. In the months that followed, my life didn't transform dramatically. I still worked at the bookstore, still walked the same streets through Seattle's steady rain, still recommended novels to customers who asked for something thoughtful to read. But something inside me had shifted permanently. For most of my life, people had described me the same way. Quiet, reliable, calm. Those descriptions were never wrong. They were just incomplete, because quietness isn't the same as weakness. Patience isn't the same as passivity, and attention, real attention, can reveal things long before anyone else realizes they're visible. Daniel believed that moving money quietly would leave me helpless. But what he misunderstood was something simple. The person who watches carefully often understands the entire story before anyone else notices it's being written. And now, standing in a life that is entirely my own again, I finally understand something about myself that other people missed for years. I was never invisible. I was simply paying attention. When people hear a story like this, they often expect a moment of triumph, a dramatic confrontation, a final argument, a scene where someone stands up and declares victory. But life rarely unfolds that way. What actually happened was much quieter. Two people who had shared 15 years of life together went their separate ways. Paperwork was signed, assets were divided. The house eventually felt like home again in a different way. Daniel moved on with his life, and so did I. There was no moment when I needed to humiliate him. No desire to punish him publicly. By the time the truth had surfaced through the documentation, the emotional part of the story had already ended. What remained was simply clarity. Looking back now, I understand something important about the way people see quiet individuals. Silence often makes others comfortable. They fill that silence with their own assumptions. They assume calm people are passive. They assume patience means blindness. They assume observation means weakness. But attention is a kind of strength most people underestimate. When you listen carefully, you notice patterns others ignore. When you remain patient, you see events unfold long before anyone else recognizes their shape. Daniel believed that emptying our joint account the night before filing for divorce would leave me helpless. What he didn't realize was that every decision he made had already left a trail behind him. Not because he was careless, because that's how systems work. Money moves. Records exist. And truth, when given enough time, has a quiet way of revealing itself. Today my life looks simple again. I still manage the bookstore. I still walk home through Seattle rain more evenings than not. Sometimes I sit by the window with a book and listen to the soft sound of traffic passing on wet streets. From the outside, someone might still describe me the same way they always have. Quiet, calm, ordinary, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that, because now I know something they don't always see. Quiet people are often the ones paying the closest attention. And sometimes, attention is the most powerful position a person can hold. So I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you, simply because you didn't feel the need to prove yourself? I'd really like to hear your story.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.